So I relied a lot for this talk on Benny Kraut's book entitled From Reform Judaism to Ethical Culture, as well as some essays by a colleague of mine, the leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, Kate Lovelady. I want to thank her for that. Both Benny Kraut and my friend Kate really illuminated an amazing story of a family, the Adler family. It begins in this version of the story with Cyril Adler, who was an Orthodox rabbi in Europe. He was the rabbinical judge for Worms in Germany. And his son, Samuel Adler, broke from Orthodoxy and became a leading religious liberal in Europe. He was part of a flourishing Reform Judaism tradition growing in Germany in the mid-1800s. Now, Samuel's son, Felix Adler, Cyril's grandson, was the founder of ethical culture. And he followed his father's tradition of rebellious modernization. He was slated to take over as rabbi of the Reform Judaism Temple Emmanuel in New York City, but he could not be confined by his past. His liberation struggle, in a way, included leaving Judaism behind and creating ethical culture. And today I want to celebrate these roots. This story is also about liberation and rebirth. About a month ago in this room, we celebrated the spring equinox, which is our traditional spring ceremony. And I urged all of those present to reflect on what seeds you might want to plant in your life or in this community. What new projects, ideas. And with metaphor and poetry, we tried to consider how in our lives we could bring new life to ourselves and our community and liberate ourselves from our past habits to new birth, to get new life and new habits and new thought. Now, most religions focus on rebirth during this time of the year. So Passover, which is this coming Friday, the 22nd of April, celebrates rebirth wrapped up in the liberation struggle. Easter, which happened a couple of weeks ago, is wrapped up by the birth of Christ and the concept of rebirth, new life at Easter time. So I'm going to explore liberation that brought ethical culture into existence. I'm not going to focus on the Jewish and the Christian stories as much as I will on the story that for us gave us liberation that was literally embodied by the Adler family. I'm going to draw on a lot of Reform Judaism in my career, and Felix Adler did as well. He sought liberation from his shackles through both getting rid of tribalism, broadening his perspective, and also by denying superstition and grabbing a hold to scientific reasoning. He rejected tribalism, which really infects every religion in one way or another, I believe, by renouncing Judaism and attempting to craft a new way of living as opposed to a belief system. He rejected superstition and tried to adapt ancient wisdom to a modern world. He wanted to bring the vital ethical lessons which were at the core of his tradition and make them fit into the growing amount of scientific modern knowledge. And this liberation led towards the heart of ethical culture, which is choosing to live a more ethical life. So that's the goal that Adler saw for himself in his future. I hope my comments today help you challenge yourself to liberate yourself from past thoughts or habits that maybe keep you from living as you want to live. I'm going to do what I always do, is I go back to the history, turn the clock back to the mid-1800s again, and talk a little bit more about Samuel Adler. As I said, he was a leader in the Reform movement, and he supported scholastic reinterpretation of Jewish scripture and law. He sought to simplify the many, many rules that existed in the Hebrew Bible by throwing away outdated vestiges of tradition and nurturing the core principles. And this was a big job because unlike Christianity that has 10 commandments, in the Hebrew Bible there is no less than 613. So Reform leaders like Samuel embraced this critical thinking and joined a growing community of scholars in Europe engaging in biblical criticism. By looking at the Bible as a historical and literary document, they began to understand that the peculiarities of culture and the historical epic affected what was written and the appropriateness of the rules in them. So he understood there might be buried universal rules in the Bible and in the holy books, but they were simply creations of flawed human beings, of flesh and blood, like you and me. So he went on to rewrite a lot of the ways we approach these rules. He actually rewrote children's curriculum, Samuel Adler did, so that it would better complement modern science. And Samuel and others also examined the religious rules governing every aspect of Jewish life, about how to dress, how to eat, when to work, when to worship, and so on. And these scholars asked if all the rules created thousands of years ago were still relevant today. So they decided you didn't really have to keep kosher, the Reformed Judaism. You did not have to pray in Hebrew. You didn't even have to have your head covered when you prayed. So Reformed Judaism said, basically, you're liberated. You can eat more liberally, you can pray in your own language, and you can leave the yarmulkes behind. Now, those were fairly radical things for an Orthodox tradition. They caused quite a stir. One particular example that I love is the story that Paulo Ribeiro, who spoke here a while ago, you may have seen him. He's an ethical culturist from New Jersey. He told me about a charity fundraising dinner that was attended by many Reformed Jews in New York, and along with Protestants, because it was a big charity thing. And what happened was the Orthodox Jews, before they ate, put on their yarmulkes, and the Reformed Jews did not. And the Orthodox Jews got furious, and they started throwing their handkerchiefs and napkins at the Reformed Jews, demanding that they cover their head. But they refused to because they were following Samuel Adler's example. One man charged the dais and was escorted out of the hall. There was even, during the benediction, Samuel Adler was giving the benediction, there was an Orthodox who began to catcall, and he was attacked by some reformers. And the brawl that broke out was actually only broken up when the mayor of New York City, Daniel Tiemann, and a group of Protestants who had been attending broke up the fight. So I take some pride in that, being from a Protestant background. Now, even more shocking than that was when Samuel Adler decided to tear down the partition that divided men and women at services in Europe. He also demanded that women have the chance to go through a coming-of-age ceremony, so the bat mitzvah began as part of the Reformed Judaism traditions. But maybe the most significant was the change in the mission of Judaism. And it's a little tricky to understand it, but Reformed Judaism maintained the traditional goals of spreading monotheism, but no longer talked about returning to or rebuilding Jerusalem. A very different mission. Kate Lovelady pointed out that the Reformed leaders replaced that mission with an emphasis on living ethical lives and embracing the brotherhood of mankind. So it begins to sound like ethical culture. Rather than the more exclusive goal of serving God and the tribe of Israel, the Reform mission was to serve all in need. And in a way, piety became less important than service. So we'll see how this plays out in Felix's life in a little bit. But the outward focus of that service goal got the Reformed leaders into trouble. As they began to speak about healing a broken world, they began to speak out about the plight of the poor in Europe. And they demanded more respect for labor in particular, and this annoyed the ruling elite of Europe, particularly the very reactionary forces in Germany in the mid-1800s. So monarchs and militarists and moneyed interests crushed the reform efforts in many different ways. Samuel's brother, Abraham, in fact, was jailed for participating in revolutionary struggles in 1848, and he died 8 years later from an illness that he contracted when he was behind bars. 1 year after his brother left, Samuel decided to take his family to safety in the United States. But he had a heavy heart. Bernie Kraut wrote, this is Samuel's words, he documents this. Samuel wrote, "It had been done, going to America, both out of consideration for my family and to gain a more extended field of action." He needed to play out his reform tendencies, and New York City was the place to go for this expanded field of action. There was a large Jewish community in New York, and they were retaining elements of their Jewish traditions, but they were eagerly integrating into the United States. And there was a balancing act. How much of our tradition do we keep, and how much do we throw away? And for many Jews coming to America, the Reformed tradition offered the best hope for this balance. Liberation from superstition. Reformed Judaism helped in that regard very much because it emphasized scholarship and reason, like most of the Jewish tradition is. I mean, rabbis are most often best understood as teachers, and Samuel Adler taught his son very well. He taught him to distinguish between eternal truths and the more conditional, superficial elements. Felix learned that what might have been divine in origin didn't necessarily have to remain divine in eternity. That's a big change. God might have created something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to remain in existence or be protected just because it's creation by God. There was a lot of examples where he simply said, this is silly to follow these old rules. And one example, actually, that was sort of interesting was that sacred music was very important. And it bothered Felix that the Orthodox tradition allowed for the shofar, which was a reed instrument, but did not allow for the organ to be played, which is also a reed instrument. And so Adler said, well, why? What's the difference? Why this inconsistency? He said, what objection can there be to have a number of reed instruments only more polished and melodious in tone? So he challenges, because a lot of temples actually took place in churches, and there were the organs. Right? So he asked questions like this of religious traditions, and he wanted to put to the test all these traditions with what he called the test of circumstances and applicability. He was a pragmatist. He was testing. Why do we have this? What are we going to do? And he was an excellent children's teacher for that reason as well. Before he went off for his PhD, he spent a lot of time in the Temple Emmanuel religious classes teaching. He had great respect for intellectualism and hard work and had a deep compassion for his students. In fact, he was so compassionate he was mildly scolded by his father once because he lent money to a needy student too liberally. His father said, you've got to be careful with that. There were a lot of great teachers at the temple, but no one was praised as much as Felix Adler. I didn't realize that until this talk. In fact, the Jewish Times reported that there was a goodbye party for Felix before he went off for his post-undergraduate degrees. And he said that Felix was, quote, deeply affected by this special ceremony in his honor, sending him off. Now, certainly this liberation that Felix was feeling from superstition is greatly due to his dedication to science. Books on religion dominated his father's library, but his father encouraged him to read everything he could get his hands on. The great tradition of looking at books was an important part in his youth and into college. In high school, Felix was known to read the latest scientific advancements and have discussions with adults. His classmates couldn't keep up with him. And related to his interest in science was his growing appreciation for nature, which plays a role on changing how you look at the natural world and superstition. In fact, one time he was prescribed nature for his ills. On his way over to Europe to go into his graduate program, he contracted bronchitis, and his doctor ordered that he go for 6 weeks at a spa and a walking tour of Switzerland in the clean air. And so before he got into his philosophy studies, hiking through the Alps created this deep reverence for nature. He had these feelings that stayed with him for his whole life. During much of the time he was an ethical culture leader, every summer he would take his family up to the Adirondacks. It was a very important time for him. But back then, during this pre-graduate degree work, Felix, quote, this is Kraut's words, progressively lost faith in religious dogmas and rituals while in Germany. He discovered the direct experience of nature to be more moving to him and of greater value than the institutionalized forms of religious worship. So, bronchitis helps bring ethical culture. Who knew? Science also came to him through the writings of a man named John Fiske, who was a member of the Free Religious Association. That was an organization that Felix headed up for a number of years later on. And Fiske was a popular supporter of Darwinism. And eventually, Felix was somebody to, quote, recognize the truths of science and transcend the superstitions of dogmatic theology. Fisk said that Felix believed in that he believed in an infinite power, but all he could know about the power was that it was manifested in nature and subjected to natural law. So really, Fisk is promoting an idea that the divine and nature are one and the same, sort of a Spinoza approach that's much closer to naturalism. In some ways, before ethical culture, Felix Adler developed a perspective similar to a lot of early American leaders, known as deism. Many of you know that. Jefferson and Washington believed basically they denied a personal God and said that if there was a God, it was basically somebody that set up the universe and natural laws and just let it operate on its own and then backed away. Those people were called atheists 250 years ago. But that did not infringe on reason because the natural laws is how things worked. Maybe it's a sort of a prime mover in a way. So Felix begins to develop this naturalized metaphysic and a liberalizing trend in Judaism. And in his graduate work, the two professors that he looked to the most to continue that evolution were Abraham Geiger and Hyman Steinthal. And Geiger and Steinthal were leading theological and spiritual thinkers in Reform Judaism in Europe at this time. And they both engaged in biblical criticism and comparative religion, which made a rational and historical approach to the divine acceptable in the high reaches of academia. And Adler held out hope that they would be the men and he would continue. Adler quoted Geiger, in fact, in his writing saying, "Judaism must be raised to become the expression of universal religious ideas." So this move from the tribe to a universal scope is in the writings of these Jewish scholars. And what most impressed Felix was this universalization of Judaism. In a way, Geiger was on the brink of declaring a moral humanism, really. Sort of what eventually became known as secular Judaism, if anybody knows the organization founded by Sherwin Wine in the United States. This appealed to Felix very much, but this hope of bringing the tradition of the contemporary world together for Adler was not satisfied with Geiger and Steinthal because he said they were too cautious. They tinkered around the edges. They didn't revolutionize the way of thinking enough. And it all became clear when Felix came back from Europe after his graduate degree studying Kant and others, Kant, who you'll hear about next week here. And he found himself giving a talk at Temple Emmanuel that was really his tryout to become the rabbi. I think he knew that it wasn't going to be a successful tryout. It was called The Judaism of the Future. And in this speech, which was delivered on October 11th of 1873, he basically said that organized religion was old-fashioned and obsolete. The sermon was well received, but the trustees went up to him afterwards and said, "You didn't mention God. You do believe in God, don't you?" And he said, "Yes, but not your God." That ended his run to be the rabbi. But the most radical part of the Judaism of the future was when he went further in talking about the mission of Judaism. He said it was simply to spread ethics to all people. He dropped talking about monotheism. The universal ethical mission was a part of the shift from the Orthodox to the Reformed branches of Judaism. And for Felix, it was a liberation from what he felt was an overly tribal approach. So this tribalism that he escapes from is partially a result also of the fact that many of the Jews coming to the United States wanted to broaden their own ability to enter into the culture. Outward, visible, symbolic aspects of Judaism were peeled away to a degree, leaving a core element of Judaism that many of the more privileged Jewish people could really participate in. If you're really spreading ethics, you could be a philanthropist and belong in the United States, which was a growing tradition in the late 1800s. So he's built synagogues and religious schools and hospitals and newspapers and other philanthropic organizations. And the philanthropic organizations really intrigued Adler. He got very involved. Because you have to remember, in the late 1800s, there were no government social safety nets, no government services. Charity was handled by religious communities. And it was a very important part of their work. and Temple Emmanuel took up many. Probably the one that interested Adler the most was the Children's Orphan Asylum, the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. He would go there often with his mother, Henrietta, who took him there, and he gained great empathy for and affection towards these children at the orphanage. Henrietta also took him into the slums of New York to feed and clothe and comfort the destitute people, and these experiences were fundamental to developing his character and continued this liberation from the past. These were character-building exercises. I mean, Felix remembers watching his mother as a model. She was gentle and warm and generous, and expressed that daily through her practical charity work. She wanted Felix and his older brother to have a direct relationship to the poor. In fact, Felix talks about how she wanted him to get a visceral, physical indignation over the poverty that so many of these people were living in. So Henrietta took him to soup kitchens and tenement houses, and he reached out to others in those situations. He wasn't a real social boy. He didn't have a lot of friends his age, and perhaps overly intellectualized. But he had deep emotional ties with the people that he was working with his mother when he was young. And that was a bridge for him between his ethical religious principles and daily life. It was for him the universal in the particular, and was really the biggest step towards what becomes ethical culture out of Reform Judaism. He gave a talk once called the Orphan Asylum Address, where he spoke of, quote, Israel's priestly mission to humanity. And it was one of the last times he talks about this being a special job for the Jewish people. He matured intellectually, and he continued to sort of drop the tribalism away, and he began to say that although the traditional mission of restoring the ancient Jewish state and dividing Jews from other nations was still a big part of Orthodoxy, he preferred to spread the idea that we're all united under one people, and that all of this would sort of morally purify him to a degree. And he drifted away from promoting monotheism and focused on the central doctrine that was known as the mission theory in Reform Judaism. He liked how it embraced all humanity and its goal, and he didn't like how some older, more traditional views said it was the Jews' particular job to do. He embraced historical interpretations where they said, look, religions are human constructs. And so he found it harder and harder to accept that God said, you be the people that spread the good around the world. That no longer made sense to him. By the mid-1800s, Bernie Kraut said that Adler was publicly repudiating prophetic ethics as universally and eternally valued, signifying his outright dismissal of the possible universality of the Jewish religion. But he did take from Judaism this emphasis on living a life where you take responsibility for the world and you try to heal it. Samuel Adler saw the moral height of Judaism in a single phrase of the Talmud that I think Felix could have held on to. The good of all nations participate in eternal bliss. All nations, not just Israel. So this unifying statement within Reform Judaism helped Adler move from Judaism, but it wasn't sufficient, because for him, he wanted to make sure that everybody realized it was their job to heal a broken world. So I'm going to turn to the part of Reform Judaism that I think is the core of ethical culture, a commitment to ethics. Adler found in Reform Judaism a clearer focus on this, and it really became the foundation of our brand of humanism. And he wondered why other people didn't see this obvious element. He asked, do you not hear the great humanitarian doctrines of Judaism re-echo in the words of the free religionists? Are they not too our brothers? So he was continuing to make the tent bigger. And thanks to his mother's emphasis on activism, his father's emphasis on education, he followed them as role models in this work. But he also went beyond them. And I want to talk at the end here about role models and how important they are. Now, in New York at this time, the labor conflicts were very, very intense. And Felix began to see the activism being directed towards what he called the labor problem. Bernie Kraut said, Adler's concern with social justice for the industrial workers, constituted the concrete manifestation of his religious ideology. Now, there is a tradition in Germany and from Reformed Judaism called the social aid tradition. And a writer named Frederick Abbott Lang promoted this. And he was really a philosopher that fed Adler's cravings for commitment to serve others. Bernie Krause said that the idealistic temperament of Adler drew him to Lang. Quote, the labor question reportedly had an effect that when Adler was reading of him, he had burning cheeks. He was so inflamed with the passion of this social commitment. As a graduate student, when he was trying to answer the labor question, he mixed activism and religion as a commitment, and he said that this commitment, quote, flowered in my breast, and that I was the first convert to my religion. He created his own religion out of that, devoid of deism, devoid of any God concept. So the reason why ethical culture grew out of Adler was that Reformed Judaism's evolution was too slow for him. He craved a deeper commitment for what he called the good. And it's no surprise that the pace of change within Judaism was too slow. I mean, this is a tradition of thousands of years with a great deal of worthwhile traditions. So it's hard to change that. But interestingly enough, Adler tended to go to Christianity, which he saw as allowing for these quicker conversions and quicker changes. And he wrote a lot about Christ, actually, especially about these swift conversions and radical inner transformations that are necessary to change the world. In one essay in 1915 called The Ethical Significance of Easter, he said that the importance of grand and swift and powerful commitments to ethical living were fundamental. He wrote, quote, religion does not intend to leave man in his depths, but to uplift him. Life at its best is rather to be thought of as grand, and Easter as a celebration of life, if not happy so much as grand. And he globed on to talk about Easter. He says, quote, Easter celebrates the triumph of death, over death. The triumph over death. First, over physical death, and then what may be called over moral death. It was this confrontation of his urge to do good with moral death that he saw all around him that intrigued him. And in Christianity, he saw this conversion experience that he thought people needed to have into humanism. He writes about Easter, on the day the churches celebrate discovery of an infallible remedy for the resurrection of the morally dead. Christianity is a society for the morally handicapped, the morally dead. In other words, that's a good religion for morally dead cultures. Jesus says, rise, and they do rise. This is the effect he produces. Men who are bad are changed so as to become good. Moral life replaces insensitiveness. A real desire for sudden transformation. And in this paradigm, he noticed that his parents had a great effect on him. But he also heard things like, well, what would Jesus do? And this emphasis, he says the Christian church, on its ethical, as distinct to its dogmatic side, this is Adler's words, is based on the thought that the way to revive the morally dead is to hold up an example of your own life. And he learned from many lives, from Jesus and from Kant and from Emerson and from the Hebrew prophets, but most of all from his mother and father, who were his examples. But they weren't enough for him to transform what he saw before him in Reformed Judaism. You had to do more. Examples are not enough. Adler said, this method itself, the method of reviving by example, must be transcended. Example only conducts us a certain way. The final outcome of our reflection is that the exemplary method itself must be transcended. In a word, the ethical interpretation of Easter, as I here submit it, is that the change from the moral death into moral life to be accomplished through the act of creating new moral ideals. And we in our age need them. The inner transformation is accomplished in the act on our part of seizing the new and the truer and rendering the moral ideal. Kraut talks about Adler's fact that he said that religion affirmed the belief in the reality of a moral power operating in the universe and demanding practical social action to implement justice and social reform. And that's, I think, a bit of the deism remaining in Adler, this moral force in the universe. But he did explicitly reject theism and redefine religion in terms of social order. So, in conclusion, as we celebrate Passover this coming Friday, which is about the liberation from slavery, for Adler, it was a liberation from the past that was not enough for him. He used his parents' example of modernization and action to go beyond his parents and create ethical culture. For him, this liberated him from the chains of both superstition and tribalism. He created a rational and universal approach to finding meaning in life that was based on how you live. That's what he gave to us. So now it's up to us. How are we going to live our lives? Are we going to live up a life, give a life that offers all of ourselves to the worth of others, to creating social justice, and doing that by creating ethical relationships between all of us? Thank you very much.